Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Jason Allen here, the Concrete Pipe Guy. I'm the Technical Resource Engineer for Oldcastle Infrastructure in the Mountain West area, and I will be presenting today's webinar. Our topic is Microbial Induced Corrosion in Concrete Sewer Structures. So some of you may not be familiar with Oldcastle Infrastructure, so I'll quickly share with you some of the solutions that we can provide. Oldcastle Infrastructure is the leading manufacturer of reinforced concrete pipe, manholes, catch basins, precast box culverts, and bridge sections in the Mountain West area. Now, our newest addition in the Utah and Idaho market is gasketed box culvert. Instead of the typical soil-type mastic joints, we now manufacture gasketed box culverts to provide a watertight joint without any additional joint treatment, which saves time and money on installation. Now, as I mentioned before, today we will be discussing the fascinating topic of microbial induced corrosion, or MIC. This is a pretty technical topic, so I'm going to try to keep it as light as possible, but let's jump right in. Now, the takeaways that we're going to discuss today is, number one, we're going to talk about the MIC process, what it is not. We're also going to talk about some mitigation options and go over some of the testing and ASTM specs associated with MIC. So before we get started, I wanted to share with you a pickup line that my son shared with me. He was taking a chemistry class, and there's a lot of chemistry in this presentation. So he told me this pickup line, and I thought it was pretty entertaining, so I thought I'd share it with you. He said, hey, girl, you're a 10 on the pH scale. You're basic. So, yeah, not the best pickup line. So I told him maybe don't use it. Probably not the best. But anyways, thought it was entertaining. Okay, so MIC, let's talk about microbial induced corrosion. There is a lot of misinformation about MIC. And so I'm hoping we can clear up some of that misinformation today. The reality is that individual instances of MIC are heavily dependent on a lot of different factors, including but not limited to wastewater characteristics, activity of relevant microorganisms, the environmental conditions, waste stream hydrodynamics, the material properties of the concrete, the geometric characteristics, and even the intended function of the structure. So microbial induced corrosion, or MIC, is also called, it's been called over the years, biogenic sulfide corrosion or hydrogen sulfide corrosion, but it was first introduced in 1945 by C.D. Parker. Okay. Now, where does it appear? Most commonly, it appears in septic sewer tanks, precast septic sewer tanks. It also appears in manholes. We see it quite often in there. And it happens quite a bit in manholes because we don't always use concrete pipe for sewer lines. Sometimes it's plastic pipe that is resistant to MIC. And so we can still see it in the concrete manholes, though. And then lastly, we'll also see it in RCP, reinforced concrete pipe. So how does it appear? Well, sulfuric acid attack will produce rough concrete surfaces showing a loss of mortar or cement and aggregates and a general spalling of the concrete itself. So damaged concrete surfaces can become soft to the touch. There will be missing aggregate pieces, and then it also can form a gel-like texture at the concrete surface. So one of the first indications of MIC is the appearance of white efflorescence above the water line in a wastewater pipe or pipe system. Now, if you look at this picture, you can kind of see that gel-like surface and that efflorescent material there. That's a clear indication that MIC is happening in this either manhole or pipe section. As we lose mortar and cement, more aggregates become exposed, which would leave a rough surface, as you see in this picture. Now, keep in mind that microbial-induced corrosion of concrete is a very slow process. Now, under natural conditions, the observed corrosion rates are in the range of 1 to 5 millimeters per year. Now, that's 0.04 to 0.2 inches per year. Another way to think about it is 1 millimeter is roughly the size of the thickness of a piece of paper. So, you're seeing anywhere from 1 to 5 pieces of paper a year corroding. So it is a relatively slow process. So there are some very common myths with MIC. The first myth is that the bacteria itself eats the concrete. That's not true. The other one is that it's hydrogen sulfide gas that corrodes the concrete. And while in both of these, bacteria and and hydrogen sulfide gas play a role in the MIC process, it isn't what causes the degradation or the corrosion of the concrete itself. Another common myth is that acid in the water gets on the concrete, and that's what causes it to degrade. Uh, Again, the acidity and the acid level in the water does play a role, but it isn't the main cause of MIC. And the last one, and probably the most common myth, is that MIC is rampant, that it's everywhere. It's going to happen in every concrete structure or every concrete pipe or manhole that you put into a sewer system. And again, that's just a myth. It's not true. Okay, so how does it occur? Well, this is a pretty fascinating topic and a conversation of how this occurs. And simply put, it comes down to bugs. All right. This is a bacterial process. Now, for years, we relied on some ASTM tests and acid resistance tests through ASTM. We relied on ACI 201 for durability of concrete. But these specifications don't address MIC because MIC is a bacterial process and it involves these bugs. So here's our situation at the beginning. Right, we've got our pipe here, and we've got our wastewater flowing through our pipe. Now, eventually, a biofilm begins to form under the liquid level. Now, this is a very, very thin biofilm. This film is made up of sulfate reducing bacteria that begin to form here. And it's an anaerobic bacteria, these SRBs, or sulfate reducing bacteria, which means they don't need oxygen. They can survive simply by consuming the sulfur that's in the wastewater. And then it converts that sulfur into an aqueous hydrogen sulfide. Now, these SRB, they start this chain reaction. Okay, the release of H2S gas or hydrogen sulfide gas depends on a few things. Number one, the turbulence of the water is the main contributing factor. For instance, just upstream of a pump station, we see this very common and happening a lot just upstream of pump stations. But it's also dependent on higher waste strength of the water, lower oxygen level in the water, just to name a few. So the biofilm is an established layer of microorganisms and organic materials that are known as extracellular polymeric substances, or EPSs. Now, these are natural polymers. They have high molecular weights. They're secreted by microorganisms into their environment. And the thickness of the biofilm present in a concrete sewer pipe is typically between 0.3 and 1 millimeter. So, we're talking 3 sheets of paper to a little less than the thickness of a dime. All right. So, depending on the velocity and flow and the frequency of abrasion by solids in the waste stream, this biofilm can vary in thickness. If you have a lot of abrasive materials going through your sewer, it might reduce the size of this biofilm. Now, unlike the conditions in actively flowing sewer pipes, the lack of significant fluid shear and physical abrasion under slow-moving or settled water situations like you'd see in maybe a septic tank or a slow, very flat sewer pipe where the water isn't flowing very fast, you may see a thicker biofilm in those surfaces below the water line. So the biofilm will contain an aerobic sulfide or sulfur oxidizing microorganism at the interface between the liquid and the biofilm. Now, as oxygen diffuses into the biofilm, it's consumed by the SOMs, and it results in a gradient of dissolved oxygen that approaches zero near the structure wall, so near the concrete there. Now, beyond the aerobic zone is an SRB population, or a sulfur-reducing bacteria population, that increases or proliferates in the oxygen-deficient conditions. Now, nearest to the concrete, the concrete surface, there's a layer of inert anaerobic bacteria whose activity is limited by the diffusion of organic food substances into the biofilm. So, simply put, sulfates from the waste stream diffuse into the biofilm towards the anaerobic zone, where they can then be reduced to sulfides. Now, under the conditions with sufficient dissolved oxygen, these sulfides will be partially or completely oxidized by the sulfur oxidizing microorganisms as they diffuse back towards the waste stream. So any sulfides that escape the biofilm can undergo a chemical or biological oxidation in the aqueous phase before they are released to the gas phase is even possible. So under anoxic conditions, or conditions where there is no dissolved oxygen in the water, these sulfides will diffuse out of the biofilm unimpeded and partition back into the waste stream. All right, I know that was extremely heavy, so we're going to take a quick break here and we're going to play everyone's favorite game, Science Experiments Gone Wrong.
We need to get some sparklers in here. I wish on this video, okay, I want everybody who's going to watch this video to see the burn spots right there.
All right, well, let's jump right back into the chemistry and let's talk about dissolved oxygen. So it's believed that dissolved oxygen has to be less than 0.1 milligrams per liters for this sulfide buildup. So factors that influence the concentration of dissolved oxygen in wastewater can include temperature, biochemical oxygen demand, and turbulence. Now, there's a few others, but these are the three main ones. So increased temperature decreases oxygen solubility and promotes bacterial activity, which leads to a depletion of dissolved oxygen, which is why you see this MIC process prevalent in warmer climates, in warmer areas, such as what in our market, what we see a lot of this down in southern Utah area, where the temperatures are higher than they are maybe in northern Utah. High biological or biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, also encourages bacterial growth and a further consumption of dissolved oxygen. And additionally, turbulence in the stream will encourage re-aeration, and it increases dissolved oxygen as that re-aeration releases oxygen into the air and comes out of the waste stream. So that would lower the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. So let's talk about these SRBs, or these sulfate-reducing bacteria that we discussed that come to be formed in this biofilm on the wall of the pipe. So these sulfate-reducing bacteria have been traced back 3.5 billion years. They are considered to be among the oldest forms of microorganisms on the planet, and they contributed significantly to the sulfur cycle soon after life emerged on Earth. So basically, these are anaerobic. So in a sense, they breathe sulfate rather than oxygen. And so it creates this anaerobic respiration. Now, most of them are what we call anaerobes. However, there are examples of some sulfate-reducing bacteria that are tolerant of oxygen and can survive in an oxygen-heavy environment. All right, so basically the presence of the dissolved sulfides in the waste stream is required for the formation of hydrogen sulfide, and which is hydrogen sulfide obviously is a component that is necessary to initiate the microbial induced corrosion in sewer networks. Now, remember, once our dissolved oxygen is less than 0.1 milligrams per liters, the reduction process can now begin. So at this point, we can actually design to decrease turbulence. So engineers can look at this and say, all right, we want to change the flow of the pipe to make sure it's a laminar flow and not turbulent. Maybe we can look at reducing the number of pump stations, or maybe there's a way that we can do some things at the pump station location to ensure that we don't have these issues. Some other things that engineers are doing to reduce the turbulence or to increase dissolved oxygen in the water is some are adding heavy metals to the water, which has, of course, its own set of inherent problems. When you inject heavy metals into a wastewater, it causes some problems downstream when you're treating it, and how do you get those heavy metals back out of the water? So that's a problem. But others are just injecting oxygen directly into the raw sewage, which can increase dissolved oxygen levels so that it will slow or stop this process. But those are a few things that engineers can do to design to make sure that this dissolved oxygen doesn't drop down to the level where we can start the MIC process. Now, keep in mind that typical pH values of municipal wastewater range from 6.0 to 8.0. So somewhere between 6 and 8 pH is the acidic. So it could be slightly acidic or slightly basic there. But this disproves that the acid in the water that is highly acidic and it corrodes the concrete itself, that the wastewater is corroding it, because a pH of 6 is not enough to corrode concrete. But as pH falls below a value of 7, and becomes into that acidic phase, then H2S, an aqueous or a water-based hydrogen sulfide, will become the dominant species in the water, which then leads to a partition of aqueous hydrogen sulfide and gaseous hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so this partition of the aqueous hydrogen sulfide into the gas phase depends on a few things. Number one, the amount of H2S aqueous in the wastewater. High aqueous concentrations encourage release of H2S aqueous according to Henry's law. If we remember back to our science classes of Henry's law, that says that the amount of dissolved gas in a liquid is directly proportional to its partial pressure above the liquid. So the higher the concentration in the water, the more likely it is to release. Also, the pH of the wastewater. Low pH encourages the speciation of sulfides to favor hydrogen sulfide aqueous, which is the species capable of partitioning into the gas phase. Additionally, retention time is a big one. The longer it has to sit there, the longer the hydrogen sulfide aqueous can build up and then release more into the atmosphere there. Additionally, temperature, we talked about that increasing the temperature increases the release of hydrogen sulfide into the gas phase by reducing the solubility of the hydrogen sulfide. And lastly, the turbulence. High turbulence increases that liquid gas surface area so that it has a more of a chance for that hydrogen sulfide to partition into the gas phase. All right, so once it's present in the sewer headspace, okay, so once we have a hydrogen sulfide gas in the headspace, which is that area above the water in the pipe, it's free to partition into the moisture film that is always present on the surface above the water line. Anytime there's water in a pipe, we're going to have a little bit of moisture on the wall of the pipe above the water line. And so this H2S gas now partitions back into the moisture film that's on that surface of the concrete. So next we observe abiotic oxidation at low pH environment. Now this is a natural occurrence. Abiotic oxidation is natural and it doesn't depend on any microorganisms. So whether there's microorganisms present or not, this abiotic oxidation is going to happen. Now, abiotic oxidation alone doesn't create these highly acidic conditions that degrade the concrete during microbial induced corrosion. Okay, the activity of sulfate oxidizing bacteria, which we'll discuss in a little bit, is necessary to oxidize the H2S aqueous and convert it into sulfuric acid. So another critical step in the process is carbonation, which we will discuss momentarily. But before we get too heavy into the carbonation process, let's have another installment of Science Experiments Gone Wrong. All right, let's jump back into carbonation here. Okay, so this process usually involves carbon dioxide under high pressure. Now, when the pressure is reduced, carbon dioxide is released from a solution as small bubbles, which causes the solution to become effervescent or fizzy. Think about your soda can. As you pop the top there, you've got carbon dioxide in extremely high pressure, and as you release that pressure, it releases the carbon dioxide into the water, causing, the bubbles and that. The longer you let it sit, the more those bubbles will diffuse out into the environment, and you no longer have a carbonated beverage. If you let it sit for hours and hours on your table there, it's not going to be as carbonated. We say, oh man, this is flat or it's stale, right? And that's what happens is it's released all of that carbon dioxide out of the liquid into the air. Now, in our situation, carbonation is a chemical reaction between the carbon dioxide in the air and the calcium hydroxide and hydrated calcium silicate in the concrete. Okay, so basically what happens is the carbon dioxide penetrates the concrete surface and dissolves in the pore water, which forms carbonic acid. And the carbonic acid that forms in the concrete's pores reacts with calcium hydroxide in the cement, which is, calcium hydroxide is a desirable product of cement hydration because it inherently strengthens the concrete mix and it produces calcium carbonate. So basically, the leaching of calcium hydroxide through contact with wastewater, along with the growth of other microorganisms, may also lead to a reduction in the pH level near the concrete surface itself. And once the concrete surface reaches a pH value of between 9 and 10, we see the colonization of thiobacillus microorganisms, also known as SOBs. Now, I have to say that these are real SOBs. Sulfate oxidizing bacteria, these are the main issue and the main problem with MIC. All right, the presence and abundance of each Thiobacillus species is heavily dependent upon a couple of things, the availability of nutrients and the pH on the concrete surface. So as I mentioned before, these are the species is referred to as Thiobacillus. All right, now these are aerobic. They eat oxygen and hydrogen sulfide gas, and then they release sulfuric acid. So if you could cut off the food source through venting, you can actually reduce this process. These Thiobacillus species thrive in pHs below 9. Okay. So think about it this way. Fresh concrete is highly alkaline or basic, right? It usually has a pH somewhere between 12.5 to 14 when it's freshly released there. But abiotic lowering, remember we talked about the abiotic oxidation. That is a naturally occurring process. It's going to happen, and it's going to lower that concrete surface of the pH naturally to around 9 or 10. Okay. So if it stays at 10, 11, 12, none of these Thiobacillus can ever colonize. However, if it drops down into 9, then we can see it start colonizing. This is a table that shows the different species. There's 5 main species of Thiobacillus. You've got the Thiobacillus thioporus, which has a preferred growth range of 5 to 9. So anything over a pH of 9, you're probably not going to see any Thiobacillus forming. But once it gets to 9 and lower, you're going to see these form. Now the Thiobacillus thioporus now processes, it eats the oxygen and the hydrogen sulfide gas, and it releases hydrogen sulfide aqueous. It forms the water on the moisture on the wall, and it creates sulfuric acid, which then reduces the pH even further. As the pH decreases, you start getting the Thiobacillus novellus, the intermedius, the neapolitanus, and the worst of all, the Thiobacillus thiooxidans. This is the one that thrives in a very, very low pH range of 0.5 to 3. And that's where you start seeing major acid reduction. The potency of the sulfuric acid that is created by each of these species as it goes down the list and becomes more concentrated and more potent, which then increases the amount of degradation of the concrete as we move forward. All right. So most concrete's able to withstand mildly acidic conditions with a pH above 6.0. All right. So the presence of these sulfur oxidizing microorganisms, or these SOBs, such as Thiobacillus thioporus, which is that first one that comes with a pH of about 9, that doesn't necessarily imply an immediate risk of corrosion to the concrete. However, the presence of these organisms does indicate that there is a potential for further ecological succession of these bigger SOBs that are acidophilic or more attracted to lower pH levels or more highly acidic situations, such as the Thiobacillus thiooxidans, and those are the ones that are associated, as I mentioned before, with severe corrosion. So exposure to acid results in the decalcification of hydrated products, beginning with calcium hydroxide, and it results in the eventual breakdown of the microstructure, results in increased porosity in the concrete, and decreased mechanical properties of the concrete itself. So let's talk about the process of degradation and how it really occurs. Now, in concrete and in cement, there's good glue and there's bad glue. There's CSH, which is your calcium silicate hydrate. This is your good glue. And then there's calcium hydroxide, which is your bad glue. And I'll explain why in a minute, why the CH is a bad glue. Now, if you have more CSH in your mix, that's going to be better. If you have less CH in your mix, that's also better. Now, pozzolans such as fly ash will react with calcium hydroxide in the cement, and it creates this CSH, this calcium silicate hydrate, which is why we want to use more pozzolans when we're doing a sewer application, so that we can have more CSH, the good glue, and less CH, the bad glue that comes directly from cement. Okay, so the damage basically occurs when the excreted sulfuric acid from these Thiobacillus microorganisms, these SOBs, as it releases the sulfuric acid, it reacts with the free lime in the calcium hydroxide. Okay, so calcium hydroxide and sulfuric acid forms what we call calcium sulfite. For those of you that are wondering, calcium sulfate is also known as gypsum. Okay, now, Gypsum isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, what happens next is this gypsum now reacts with the aluminum in C3A, which is tricalcium aluminate. And as gypsum reacts with the aluminum, it forms something called ettringite. Now, ettringite, again, is not inherently a bad thing. However, when it starts forming in hardened concrete, that's when we start having some problems. Okay, because ettringite, as it gets exposed to water or moisture, it begins expanding. So think about what would happen to hardened concrete if you get ettringite in the pores or into the little cracks of the concrete, and it gets hydrated and now it starts expanding. This expansion can cause concrete to crack, to spall. It causes aggregates to pull away. It allows for deeper penetration of the acid, and then it continues this corrosion cycle further and further. All right, I know that's a lot of chemistry. So let's take a quick break and let's have another segment here of science experiments gone wrong.
Good job.
Okay, so there's three things basically we can examine and look at here. All right, number one is we could possibly change the concrete itself. Now we're already making good concrete, all right, but are we making the best possible concrete for this application? Are we looking at the lowest water to cement ratio possible? Are we looking at low porosity, the lower the porosity of the concrete, the less of a chance that it has to get into the pores and cause some major problems there. Are we looking at ways that we can have less CH in our mixes? So are we using more pozzolan? So these are some things that we can look at with the concrete itself. All right. The second thing we can look at examining and changing is the environment. Okay. Can we look at venting or encouraging positive movement of air through the system so that it never really has a chance for this H2S gas to build up on the side and form these thiobacillus, these SOBs having a chance to form the biofilm. Can we also design the pipe to have lower turbulence so we don't have as many issues with that? Those are some things that we can look at with the environment itself. And lastly is we can look at changing the concrete to environment interface, whether that's through coatings, liners, barriers, or potentially maybe some additives as we look at this in the future. So as we look at these three things, the concrete, right? We're pretty good there. The environment, right? We're trying to do everything we can. Now we have to look at this interface between the two. And that's where things started getting a little bit dicey and where we kind of come into play with what I call and what has been referred to in our industry as the Purdue study. Now, prior to the Purdue study being released, there was a lot of misinformation, and a lot of this information contradicted each other. There were a lot of additive companies trying to go out and peddle these to different specifiers saying, oh yeah, we have this additive that's a micro or an antimicrobial. I think it's similar to what you put in your clothes or to kill the microorganisms and kill these bacteria before they even attach to the wall. And so they had all these claims that really there wasn't a way to substantiate it. There wasn't any way to prove whether it worked or it didn't work. And so that's where the Purdue study came in. And basically the Purdue study was able to build equipment to replicate the sewer environment in a lab. That's all it was. Unfortunately, a lot of these people who were selling these additives said that the Purdue study was the silver bullet, that it proved that these things worked, and it didn't. That's not what the Purdue study was. It was much different than that. It was basically the beginning stages of this study and the investigation process on whether these antimicrobial additives could work. So it was a necessary step to get us along the path to find out whether or not these additives will work as we add them to concrete, but it was not the silver bullet, and it did not have the answers. I had a chance to get a copy of the Purdue study. I read it, and I'll provide you with a quick summary here on what the study was. Okay. So first of all, the Purdue study took 12 samples of varying mix designs, 12 concrete samples. And it looked at different mix designs with a different water cement ratio. They looked at using pozzolans, different pozzolans, and evaluated what these 12 different samples were. And they created They created a biological growth chamber in the lab to grow these things to see what would happen as we put this bacteria into place and what it would do to these 12 different mix samples. They also developed safety protocols for sulfuric acid within this chamber, this growth chamber. Next, they obtained bacteria samples, which, keep in mind, these are highly toxic. These thiobacillus, they looked at the thioporus, the novellus, the intermedius, the neapolitanus, and the thiooxidans. They inoculated the samples with these different strains of thiobacillus to see what it would do to different concrete samples. And then they left them for 112 days. So the samples at the top that you see in those pictures, those are the original samples. And then the bottom samples on those, that's those same samples after 112 days of exposure to the thiobacillus. So you could see the different strains of thiobacillus, what it does to this concrete. They also looked at an acid immersion test and trying to improve upon the acid immersion test to see what would happen to concrete as it's exposed to this acid. So that the higher the acid, they wanted to duplicate what happens as you get down into the thiobacillus thiooxidans, as it's releasing highly concentrated levels of sulfuric acid. What is that going to do to the concrete? So that's why they tried to improve upon the acid immersion test that was already existing in ASTM. So the top is a pH of 2 after 112 days. And the bottom, you can see they actually exposed it in acid with a pH of 0.5. And that was only for 56 days. So half the time, but an extremely low pH. So a very acidic situation. And what they found was that high water to cement ratio shows a reduction in performance of the concrete. So you want a lower water to cement ratio if possible. And they also showed that supplementary cementitious materials or pozzolans show general improved performance when exposed to these acid levels. So kind of what we would expect to see by the science that we discussed earlier. But they also learned that the acid test could be modified to provide a little bit of less gray area in these tests. So they also found that it's a three-phase process here. This microbial induced corrosion, or MIC, is a three-phase process. Okay, so the first phase is what they call the carbonation phase, right? So you can see the pH level. That red line is the pH as it goes. So when concrete is freshly manufactured, we have a pH of 12.5 to 14. And the phase one is that naturally occurring carbonation phase where it lowers the surface pH of the concrete to 10 to 11. Right? Again, naturally occurring in all concrete. It happens no matter what the application, whether it's stormwater, whether it's wastewater, whether it's a utility conduit. This is a naturally occurring process. All right. Then we step on to phase two. Now, phase two, this is where the biofilm becomes established both in the water section and above the water section. And this is where we start. This biofilm phase provides the necessary conditions for those thiobacillus to inhabit the concrete surface. And the first species of thiobacillus excrete really weak acids by consuming the available hydrogen sulfide gas and the available oxygen in the aerobic environment of the wastewater system. And then this excreted acid lowers the concrete surface pH, which enables thiobacillus species that produce stronger acids to inhabit the biofilm. And this process continues well into phase three, where concrete corrosion occurs. So they call this the attachment phase. And that's when the biofilm attaches to the pipe. And this is where when we're looking at the additives that we can put into the concrete, this is where those additives can potentially take away this attachment phase so that the biofilm never actually attaches. At least that's what the theory was with these additives and what they're testing now and what we're looking at. So you've got carbonation and attachment. And lastly, the phase three, this is the deterioration phase. Okay, so this is where the real damage occurs when the excreted sulfuric acid reacts with the free lime in the calcium hydroxide and forms calcium sulfate or gypsum. Right. And so at this point, the mix design and concrete quality really comes into play. So hopefully we never get to this phase, but water to cement ratio plays a critical role here. The use of pozzolans and those also play a critical role here. But hopefully the plan is, and the hope is, that if we can find some type of additive that is antimicrobial or antibacterial that can stop this from ever happening, and we can stop it at the attachment phase, we're hoping that that's what will happen. All right, so some of the conclusions from the Purdue study were that MIC is a three-stage process that relates to bacterial growth and the surface pH inside the tank above the liquid level. They devised testing protocol that mimics an environment which MIC could thrive. They learned that it's very dangerous and difficult to maintain and difficult to control. Even though they devised these testing protocols, it was very dangerous. They also found that the development of a single comprehensive test method to evaluate concrete resistance to MIC is inherently complex. And it's going to be, they determined that it would be more useful to investigate each of the three stages, carbonation, attachment, and deterioration separately. But they did find in one of their conclusions that the use of supplementary cementitious materials and limestone show benefits. So, all right, let's take a little break here and go back to another science experiment gone wrong. All right. So here's the problem, right? This is the problem that was faced with specifiers, that was faced with our industry. There was a lot of misinformation for specifiers. As I mentioned before, you had all of these people coming in and selling that, which I referred to as the common snake oil, where there were all these claims being made, but there was really it was all theoretical. There weren't any tests or any ASTMs or any specifications to back up what they were saying. And so the problem for us as an industry came down to nobody remembers the name of the salesman who sold them the additive to put in there. They just remember who manufactured the pipe. So, if Oldcastle makes the pipe or the manhole or the septic tank, and then it starts deteriorating, they're going to say, well, wait a second, Oldcastle, you sold us a bad product. Well, we just put the additive in that you asked us to. And so we would get the blame down the road, was our fear, for a promise that was made by someone other than us. So that can be a major issue and a major problem. So another problem was that there were no standardized tests for these MIC additives, as I mentioned. So they could make claims, but there weren't any tests for them. And we also know that the acid immersion test had flaws. That's what we learned in the Purdue study. Even though they tried to improve on it, there's still some flaws. And we realize as an industry that we need standardized tests simulating these MIC conditions to ascertain concrete resistance and what these additives really would do. So they come in and make all these claims to these specifying engineers, but there really wasn't any way to back it up and show what was happening. And so we really needed these standardized tests, which luckily a member of our industry, Mel Marshall, who we recently lost. He passed away after many, many years in our industry. He stepped up and said, we need to create a subcommittee in ASTM that can look into this and determine what really is going on and if there's a solution here. And so Mel Marshall, with a few others, formed ASTM C1303. It's a subcommittee in ASTM on determining the effects of biogenic sulfuric acid on concrete pipe and structures. And so this group obtained a proposal from Dr. Jason Weiss, who wrote and was overseeing the Purdue study. He worked with the doctorate student that did the Purdue study, and then Dr. Burke and Iskor. They received this proposal in late 2015. Now, they had several meetings in 2015 and 2016 to understand the full scope. They were able to receive donations to fund the project, and the notice to proceed was given in January of 2017. Now, shortly after this, Dr. Weiss relocated to Oregon State University, and I was able to go on site to Oregon State and meet with Dr. Weiss and ask him some questions and see what they were doing as part of these processes. And it was pretty fascinating things that they were doing. And that was in 2017, 2018. We were talking to him about that, and we were involved in it. And it was really cool to see some of the things that they are doing. Out of this committee came ASTM C1904, which was completed in 2020. So what this does is it created some testing protocols. All right, there's testing protocols for phase one. As I mentioned before, they determined from the Purdue study they should investigate this in each of the different phases. So phase one is that carbonation phase. Really, there's not much to test here because we know that carbonation will occur no matter what. It's just a naturally occurring event that doesn't depend on any of these microorganisms or anything. So there's really not much that you can do to test that, to slow it down. It's going to happen. Concrete is going to go from a pH of 14 or so down to 10 naturally. That's just what's going to happen. But in phase 2, that attachment phase, this is where maybe there are some studies that we could study attachment and the growth potential of the microorganisms in the biofilm. And this is where it's important for the admixtures and sealers and different things to put something on the concrete or in the concrete to keep the biofilm from attaching to the concrete itself and creating this environment for these thiobacillus to thrive. And then phase 3, deterioration. So once we get to phase 3, we know the concrete's going to deteriorate and it's going to get into failure mode. But maybe there's some things that we could do with acid immersion studies to fix those gray areas. So those are the testing protocols. Not much in phase 1, but phase 2 is where a bulk of the studies need to happen for those additives. And then phase 3 is what can we do to learn more about concrete's interaction with these highly acidic compounds that are coming out of the microorganisms. All right. So the proposal that they received was stage 1. They wanted to create a guide specification that will outline the biogenic sulfuric acid degradation process and discuss appropriate and inappropriate test methods for each stage of deterioration. And the test methods could be used to compare resistance of different types of concrete to microbiologically induced corrosion and resemble what is done for internal curing, which is discussed in ASTM C1761. So they had stage 2 was they would develop these two tests. So step 1 was to test the measure. To measure the efficiency of an additive in neutralizing the bacteria in the solution. And then test 2 would measure bacterial activity and effectiveness of antimicrobial additives in concrete. And test 3 is measure the presence and dosage of antimicrobial additives in concrete. So stage 2, step 1 is that development of those bacterial attachment test methods. And then stage 2, step 2 would be development of acid resistance test method to see what we can do with concrete mixes to make it hold up a little bit better in highly acidic situations. So the results were ASTM C1894, Standard Guide for Microbial Induced Corrosion of Concrete Products, ASTM C1898, Standard Test Methods for Determining the Chemical Resistance of Concrete Products to Acid Attack, and ASTM C1904, Standard Test Methods for Determination of the Effects of Biogenic Acidification on Concrete Antimicrobial Additives and or Concrete Products. Whew. That is a mouthful. Now, before we jump into those ASTMs, let's have one final installment of Science Experiments Gone Wrong.
1, 2, 3, let me know. Okay. 3.
Ouch. Okay. Well, as painful as that is, let's add some pain by going over some of these ASTMs and what's included in these. Now, the point of these ASTMs, now these again are not the silver bullet that we were expecting. It doesn't, we're really still not at a point. I hate to bury the lead, but we're really still not at a point where we have any evidence that these additives do work, but we're closer. We're getting there. We now have at least established test methods. So in ASTM C1894, I do want to point out that in section 1.1, this is what it says. This guide discusses microbial induced corrosion, MIC, of concrete products and laboratory test methods for determining the resistance of concrete to MIC. 1.2. While this guide discusses concrete materials and admixtures, the document is not intended to specifically address field exposure conditions of sewage pipe, concrete tank, or concrete riser network design. So, again, this is just a guide to talk about the tests. It doesn't necessarily show whether the additives work or not. It just talks about the tests that you can do to show whether the additives work or not. So again, we're not quite there. If someone says, well, we have ASTM C1894 and it says that this works, well, show me the test results that you did based on ASTM C1894. Don't cite the spec and say that it works, because this spec is just about the test itself. We also had ASTM C1898, which in 4.3, it says the results obtained by these test methods should serve as a guide in, but not as the sole basis for, selection of a chemical resistant material for a particular application. No attempt has been made to incorporate this into this test method all the various factors that may affect the performance of a material when subjected to actual service. So while we are investigating and looking at these additives, we still don't know exactly how they're going to work when they're put into actual service. These are only hypothetical testing. And then ASTM C1904 says basically the same thing. The results obtained in these test methods should serve as information to be used with guide C1894 in, but not as a sole basis for selection of biologically resistant material for a particular application. No attempt has been made to incorporate into these test methods all the various factors that may affect the performance of a material when subjected to actual service. So again, we're not quite there yet, but we're darn close. We're getting there. We're moving closer and closer. So in summary, MIC is not everywhere. It is not rampant. That is a myth. It doesn't happen all the time. Sulfates to sulfides to aqueous H2S to H2S gas, that is the process. We take the sulfates, they're converted to sulfides. Those are converted to aqueous hydrogen sulfide, which is then converted to hydrogen sulfide gas. We know that it's a 3-stage process, and there are test protocols in place. So we now have the test protocols to test these in a lab. However, they haven't completed the field studies. So that is what is going on now. That is what our industry is doing next, is we are doing all the field studies to see and to address those two issues in those last two specs we discussed in section 4.3 and 4.4 of C1898 and C1904. This is now what we're doing, these field studies, to determine whether these antibacterial and antimicrobial additives will actually work. We also learned that the producer should focus on quality concrete with a low water to cement ratio, with high strength, denser concrete with less porosity, and the use of more pozzolans and supplementary cementitious materials. Those are the things that we've learned through this testing process and through the ASTM C1303 committee. And so I think there's a lot of promise in this. We're not quite there yet, but we're seeing some good things in our industry, and we're moving in the right direction to address MIC. So again, the takeaways that we discussed today, we discussed the MIC process, we talked about some mitigation options, and we also talked about testing and the ASTM specifications. So thank you again for taking part in this webinar. For more information about this topic or any Oldcastle products discussed in this presentation, please email me at jason.allen@oldcastle.com or visit oldcastleinfrastructure.com.